Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Destination Marketing webinar presented by Destination Think. Today's webinar is called Opportunities for New DMO Business Models. We're really glad you're here. And before we begin, I just have one housekeeping note. You'll find a chat window on the right-hand side of your screen. You might see that there. You can use that to communicate with us or to pose questions during the webinar. Just to test that out, can everybody hear me and see the title slide with the rock climber? Just chat me a yes if you can see me, or if you can hear me, sorry. Perfect. Seeing some yeses. That's great. Thanks, everybody. So thanks again for joining us today. My name is David Archer. I'm Marketing Manager with Destination Think, and I'm also the editor of our publication at destinationthink.com, where we share valuable insights and innovations from destination marketing leaders from many places around the world. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to check that out and sign up for our weekly DMO Matters newsletter at destinationthink.com. And we're so pleased to see leaders representing different destinations from many countries around the world. We're broadcasting today from Vancouver, but we'd like to thank those who are dialing in maybe from Europe or from Australia. You might be up early or up late, so thank you for joining us. And if you aren't familiar with us, Destination Think is a world-leading partner of some of the most innovative destinations. Our agency and consultancy draws on some deep experience and expertise that helps DMOs meet today's challenges through strategic planning and execution. So we'll begin today's webinar, which is the second presentation in our webinar series. You might remember from December, we heard our chief strategist, William Bacher, speak about structuring your organization to lead your destination into the future. If you missed that, the recording is up at destinationthink.com. You can just visit there and search webinar. There's a little summary and the recording. And then in a few weeks' time, on February 6th, we'll hear from Marketing Manager John Freeman, who will present a content marketing webinar, including case studies from different destinations. So today is all about opportunities for new DMO business models, and we'll hear from our senior strategist, Aaron Nissen. So after my little introduction here, we'll hear the presentation, and Aaron will go through some of the different funding models and the spectrum that he'll present, and then we'll take a deeper look into insights from destinations around the world. And an important note, we will have a Q&A time as well. So we'll be covering a lot of some deep topics here, so save your questions. And if you have a question during the webinar, just enter it into the chat window, the same place you entered yes, and we'll save those questions for the Q&A time at the end. So, yeah, so we'll hear right away from Aaron Nissen, our senior strategic consultant. Aaron has created highly effective strategies for leading destinations around the world during his 5 years at Destination Think. His insight has guided destinations across North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. He's got 12 years of destination strategy, branding, and marketing experience, and was the director of e-strategies at Travel Alberta in Canada for 7 years. He led organizational change to streamline processes and marketing efforts, and was responsible for an annual budget of $3.2 million. Aaron also chaired the National Digital Committee for Canadian DMOs for 3 years, and he holds a degree in computer engineering technology. In today's webinar, Aaron will explore important questions related to DMO revenue streams, and so you'll learn how destinations are addressing their funding challenges as they work to build long-term stability. And Aaron has researched many of the alternative methods that are helping destinations secure future revenue that they need. So sit back and prepare to learn and engage and ask questions. Remember to type them into the chat box as we go. And without further ado, here's Aaron Nissen.
Thanks, David. Hello, everyone. So yeah, my name's Aaron Nissen, and I'm going to today cover the full gamut of funding models for DMOs. What I did a couple months back in preparation for an event that we hosted in New York called Forum was I combed the world to take a look at what kind of funding models are out there to get a good sense of just getting a better understanding of how these funding models may work in other parts of the world, and then even looking at how those funding models impact stakeholder relationships, and then trying to suss out if there's any succinct trends that are occurring throughout the world, and then just be inspired by new funding models and ideas. This was the tone that I took in terms of approaching this. So today I'm going to walk you through some of these funding models, and then we'll do a bit of a deeper dive and deeper look at how they're structured and then the impact they actually have. One of the high-level observations that I have is soliciting a new funding model or new funding for any DMO is not a linear task. There's a myriad of different stakeholder relations that need to occur before new funding models are in place. So we'll cover that towards the end. But for now, let's just take a look at the different models. So to try and categorize this into a linear way of talking about these different funding models, I've taken the liberty of categorizing into 4 distinct models. Now, they're not perfect. There's going to be some overlap between the two, and you can argue that one might be a little bit more of taxes versus cost recovery, but it's more of a general guide to kind of indicate the spectrum. So starting with the left side, we have typically based government funding models, which start with things like taxes, bed taxes, general revenue funding models, and then they move more towards cost recovery, such as taking care of public services that are impacted through the tourism sector, and finding ways to recover costs there. And then moving towards the industry side of the spectrum, co-funding models, and then more industry-led. So this would be the kind of gamut that I cover today, looking at a few different options and exploring this. So I'll start with the first one here, bed taxes. I think most people in the tourism world have encountered a bed tax at some time. It's a pretty standard way of going about setting up a DMO, and typically what I've found is that most bed taxes are about 1 to 4%. In some extreme cases, it gets upward of about 12%, I think in the case of Las Vegas. And this model's been around probably since DMOs have started out. So it's pretty common. I think most of us have seen some form of this in one way or the other. Now, the reason I did call this appropriation and taxes is that these revenues, whether bed tax or some of the other models here, all flow through a government entity, and then they dole out those funding as they see fit. So they can change and fluctuate the amount that they threshold and give back to the community or to the tourism sector. So looking a little bit different from a pure bed tax. Back in my home here in British Columbia, BC has a general revenue funding model where they're funded by the provincial government that determines a preset amount every year. So this is a long history of evolution in terms of BC, and I believe they're actually going to be going through a few new changes as well. But currently they're funded at approximately $50 million, and that's based on, again, central revenues that come from a provincial sales tax and other sources, then deemed to be important for tourism, and that's how they're assigned their budget on an annual basis. It does have some lag periods, and it can become a little bit difficult to plan and forecast long term, and it's also not a performance-based tax or a performance-based model. So if DBC, or sorry, Destination British Columbia, does an amazing job, they're not guaranteed to grow their revenue. So it's kind of a flat cap. Looking at some of the other models around Canada, and this recently just occurred last year, but Manitoba entered a new partnership with the federal or provincial government, sorry, to assign a 96-4% split. So with the provincial government, they looked at a bunch of their tourism sector businesses that were deemed as such by the revenue agency there. And so as a percentage of that tax, the government will collect 100%, and 4% goes back towards tourism marketing. So the good thing about this model is it is committed for several years long term. I think it's 10 years. So it gives Tourism Manitoba a sustainable long-term approach. It is performance-based, so as they grow revenues, so too should their budgets for future years. When I took the time to sit down with their CEO and interview them, one thing that did come up though, and one potential vulnerability, is that if the economy has a significant downturn, they may be asked to give a different percentage of that back into the government. So while it is an agreement, the government does have final say over the actual percentage that get doled out. This was something that happened in Tourism Alberta a couple of years ago when the oil economy kind of took a decline. Their revenues were cut from a tourism perspective to help fund some of the other bodies within the government. So that is one of the risks of a government-based appropriation tax. So looking more globally to take a look at other forms of a tax model, Venice Tourism has a $1 per person, per star, per hotel. And this is €1, not dollar. And it fluctuates from season to season based on high and low. And this is just a model that they use for, not for marketing purposes, but to cover their infrastructure, protect their environment, and give back to the community. Now, this is where things got interesting for me when I observed Venice and a few other European communities. While in North America, many DMOs are looking at a rapid growth model. They want more heads and beds, more people to their destination, whereas in some of the European countries and smaller tourism areas, they're at capacity, and Venice is a prime example. They're starting to be overrun by tourists, and it's causing challenges on their infrastructure, protecting their UNESCO reef is at risk, and a few other situations. So this funding goes towards protecting and conserving the public's way of life. Another unique model, and I think one of the models that I kind of took a liking to, was the Maldives. They used to have a bed tax up until about 2010. And then they realized that they were pandering a little bit to the hotel sector. Many of their decisions were geared towards how do we get heads in beds, but in reality, from a consumer perspective, people aren't going to a place to stay in a hotel. They're going for the experience or experiences. They need a place to stay, so they happen to stay in a hotel. The timing of this is quite well with the rise of Airbnb, etc. But they were able to implement a tourism GST. So it is a national tax that is imposed on any business deemed as a tourism sector. And it's gone from 3 to 6 to now 8% as of, I think, last year. So it's an 8% tourism tax applied to tourism businesses that gets fed back into infrastructure and marketing promotions. What I really liked about this model is that it was very forward-thinking, and it allowed them to balance their needs across multiple sectors and not just a hotel. So they can also look at, operators, attractions, ecotourism businesses, etc., like that. So this seemed to be a very strong and balanced approach to generating revenue. I think one of the other last major forms of tax reform was the departure tax. And this largely happens for national or NTOs. In most cases, it's applied directly to the airlines. Some places will have it on cruise ships, even some car traffic, and it kind of varies from nation to nation. But this is pretty standard for UK, Australia, the US, etc., like that. And it's usually buried within the cost of your airline ticket. So not relevant to everybody, but just a standard way. You could also make the case that this is almost getting into a bit of a cost recovery, because in a way it funds infrastructure for the airports and other public tourism related services. So again, as I mentioned, some of these models tend to blur a little bit. So just to kind of review the appropriations or the tax format, the key thing here is that the government takes control of the funds and they distribute it in a way that creates a little bit of political volatility, especially during election years. In preparation for this, for the event in New York, I talked to many small counties throughout the US who were basically being used as a ping pong in an election battle to generate revenue or potentially take it away. So depending on the size of the DMO, there's a little bit more volatility towards election cycles, etc., like that. And I'm sure most of you guys have experienced this in one form or another. But the key thing, again, government controls the funds, and then they may make decisions based on what's good for the greater community. If economy goes down, like in Alberta, some of that tourism funding may get pulled. Because it's an annual budget cycle, typically to governments, it becomes difficult to plan long term. Budgets may, be estimated at a steady pace year over year, but if something disastrous happens, a hurricane hits, and money needs to be used for other public services, your funding may be diminished. So it makes it hard to commit to those plans long term and really see a complete vision. And then I think lastly, this is a very traditional approach that many people have just gone with. It's easy, it's what we know, and therefore it's just easy to roll out and implement. Governments are happy with it because it's a tried and true form of a funding system. So looking more towards cost recovery, and what I found interesting about what I'm going to call cost recovery is I would say this is probably one of the bigger growing trends for destinations. In the case here of Margaret River, it's a small region on the southwest tip of Australia, about 3.5 hours south of Perth. And at the time, Margaret River was a small community surrounded by wine regions. And then there was a couple other tourism destinations within the region. And they're all relatively small. So collectively, they pooled their resources and said, hey, let's become one unified region so that we can actually do more with our funding. But more interesting is how they then purchased 6 key attractions within the region. There's several caves, a lighthouse, a couple lighthouses as well. And so what they did as a DMO now is they generate 60% of their revenue from these 6 attractions. So they charge admissions, they look after the administration, the overhead, they manage the experience, etc., like that. So this model works quite well to generate their own revenues. However, it is causing some challenges in that they can't just promote their own attractions, even though that generates the most revenue. They also have to balance that with their wineries and other partners and other attractions. Because of this model, they've also gotten into the booking system. So from a visitor experience, our visitor center, they actually make a commission on any bookings to one of their partners. And this is a revenue source that they know is diminishing, and they're trying to find new ways. And that's where they have to find that balance of that 60% comes from 6 attractions. They can't keep pandering to those ones, so they need to be cautious of how they operate with their industry. So it's a very unique model. A few other destinations may have, one city attraction that generates some revenue, etc., like that. But what's great about this is that it allows them to control those tourism experiences from tip to toe. Those 6 attractions also tend to be the most talked about consumer items because it's a really high quality tourism experience. The growing trend here that I mentioned and alluded to was kind of these eco-taxes. And this is the case of the Balearic Islands, which is a bit of a, I guess it's been a bit of a tourism haven for UK tourists. It's a nice beach destination and it's easy to get to. But what's happening is that there's an influx of mass tourists during given peak periods or on weekends and certain times of the year that it really causes chaos for locals from their infrastructure. You can see that picture of the beach just lined up with loungers and people. So they started to acknowledge that this is becoming a public nuisance for us and disrupting our community. Let's start taxing visitors who come in at these periods to generate revenue, to cover infrastructure costs, and give back to the community. So this is something I'm seeing more and more of. And again, being a North American, a lot of destinations in North America don't have these issues because we have a lot more space and we're still in the growth phase of more tourists and more revenues. And then there's Barcelona. Barcelona is an interesting one. There's actually been quite a bit about them in the media. There's a really interesting documentary called Bye Bye Barcelona that I would recommend you taking a look at. You can see it on YouTube, but it's from a local's perspective. And what it talks about is how the city is becoming a little bit overrun with tourists, and it's changing the nature of the businesses, and it's just disrupting the way of life. So Barcelona, they actually have a bed tax that they've been predominantly using. But one of their big challenges is that they are a massive cruise industry. So the cruise industry comes in, parks for a day, dumps thousands of people off into the downtown area, and then they leave that night. And what they realized is that large dump of people during the peak periods is causing a massive disruption in certain corridors. So what they're trying to do is they're looking at imposing a day tax for people who come in just for the day. Because, like I mentioned, the public services and infrastructure are taking a bit of a beating, and they need to find a sustainable way. So Barcelona is actually looking at this as a way to filter traffic a little bit and still maintain the way of life for residents. So as I mentioned, this is kind of a growing trend in very competitive destinations with high number of visitors per annum. So that kind of led me to realize that from a tourism revenue perspective, I think many destinations are still in the growth phase and looking at more and more and more and more. But at a certain point, we need to start thinking about the right visitors. And Barcelona is a perfect example. While the cruise ship day passengers may not be the best traffic because they don't spend overnight, they may eat, they may not, they may shop a little bit, they're probably, actually, they don't have as high of a yield as an overnight traveler. So for destinations that are still growing, this is something we need to think about. Are we attracting the right visitors long term, or are we just doing things in the short term to get our revenues up or our heads in beds? So the balance from a tourism perspective is really important. We need to be thinking as DMOs and leaders of our tourism sector, what is the balance between businesses, visitors, and residents? And oftentimes, as DMOs being the promotional lead, we are focused just on marketing. And we don't stop to think about our shoulder seasons or our busy seasons and the impact it may have on residents. And so as I was researching this, I realized some destinations are at that point where residents are unhappy with tourism and it's starting to become detrimental. And that's influencing public policies on events and other things. So it has a negative effect in the long term. One such example, just to kind of illustrate this, was Aruba. Aruba has a very, they have, I think it's 34% of their hotel space is based on all-inclusive resorts. So what they realized was that the all-inclusives were growing quite rapidly. And so on the books, it looks great. Revenues coming in, more people, more money, etc. But in reality, all-inclusives aren't going into the community and they're not improving the quality of life for the island. 80% of the revenue goes to the international hotels and to the airlines. So Aruba passed a policy recently capping the number of all-inclusives to try and give a better balance to residents and other businesses so that tourism is benefiting them and their economy. So these are all very interesting learning and observations that I think many North American destinations aren't quite there yet. But when planning and building revenue models, these are things that we need to be planning for down the road. So just to kind of summarize the cost recovery, what I'm observing here is that this is a bit of a move towards a holistic approach to tourism management. It's not just about the promotions, but it's also really thinking about the sustainability. How can we generate the right types of revenues to protect our environment and support our residents, et cetera, like that. That money could also be used for marketing promotions as well, if done properly. But there's a real thought to the balance of quality of life for residents. Residents tend to be our biggest advocates and ambassadors, and that's also something to factor in. If people aren't happy with their community because of tourists, they're going to tell their friends, don't come, it's busy, etc., like that, and it could have a negative effect. You want your residents to be champions for your community. As in the case of Barcelona, the cost recovery model can be used to slow tourism or maybe disperse it to the right areas. So it's a way to kind of manage yield and dispersal, etc. And as I mentioned, this is one of the growing trends from a revenue perspective is many destinations are looking at this. Many of us already have this through a national park or even a provincial park fee. So it's not much different, it's just applied in the right places. So looking at co-funding models, I think co-funding is another thing that's been quite common. You know, most of us probably do it through visitor guides. You know, you charge a small fee to have an ad to cover the cost of it, etc. In the case of Destination Canada, their budget had been slashed quite a bit over the course of 3 years. They went from about 100 million towards 50 million over 3 years. And what was happening is they were losing a lot of market share in the US. So the industry on their behalf, the Tourism Industry Association in Canada, kind of band together and said, hey guys, we're losing American travelers, let's lobby the government to get a new funding model to support us in the Americas. So they lobbied, and the net result was they were given, I believe, 30 million, and I think there was a few small injections on top of that. But the core of it was 30 million over 3 years. That needed to be matched at 1.25 from industry partner funds. So altogether, it's 67.5 million. So this is how they've kind of gone about tackling the US approach. It's caused some challenges in terms of the industry because they need to hit that quota for the 1.25. There's a lot of pressure to meet the stakeholder of the government's needs, but it's also coming at the cost of the industry. So it's working for them, but there's some good and bad with these types of models. And one of the things I observed holistically is that sometimes the administrative cost to do these co-op funding initiatives may actually not be worth it. You know, when you look at your visitor guide every year, I've worked with many DMOs who spend a lot of time, and it's a frantic thing to get it done, and you're out there knocking on doors, selling ad space to get it done. But the net result, if you didn't do it, would it be much different? So this is an area that I'm a little bit cautious of because I've seen some good and some bad in terms of administration costs. So just a summary, I think most of us have done a co-funding initiative, maybe just a campaign, etc. There's definitely a lot of ways that co-funding looks like. There is definitely a time cost that I think many of us don't quite factor in. So it's something I would urge you to consider. And what is good about this is it is a way to direct your vision. You can say, you know, applying for grants, you can kind of guide the areas you get funding from and for which purpose. So in a way, it is kind of a good tool to steer your industry in a direction you want to go. One of the trends I'm seeing with co-funding is it's increasingly non-traditional. I'm seeing destinations like Amsterdam partner with Tiesto and Heineken, and they're partnering with brands outside of the tourism space. That's becoming a bit more of a trend. So it is a smart way for DMOs to find brands that match their personalities to do a co-op initiative. So lastly, and I think this was the other big trend that I really wanted to spend time on, is what's called the Tourism Improvement District. Now, this comes in several different formats: Tourism Business Improvement District, or even just a Business Improvement District. Typically what this model is it's self-governed by industry. Industry will pool funds together and hand it off to a third party. Typically it's the DMO, it may be a hotel coalition. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The concept is it's a public-private partnership of saying, hey, we as a tourism industry need to find a new revenue source, and we're going to pool tourism resources to give funding towards marketing and to some extent some development. Typically, this is focused on promotions. There are some examples and exceptions. The challenge I had with this is that there is so many variants of what a tourism improvement district funding model looks like. So it's going to be different for each region, state, based on legislation, et cetera, like that. So with that in mind, I'll walk you through a few scenarios. The first one I think was Visit California. They're kind of the pioneer in this space. Back in the early 90s, they passed statewide legislation saying any region or city can create their own tourism improvement district, and they basically turned it over to their industry. I think there's now 90-some tourism districts of varying size throughout California. So it's been hugely successful for them. Many of you might have heard, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, that Visit California decided to actually double their revenues by increasing the tourism improvement fee charged with all participating businesses. What had happened was the industry got together and said, look, we're lagging behind places like Hawaii and Florida because our budget's smaller than theirs. So the industry decided, and they passed in to double their levy fees and give that to California, and that's how essentially they doubled their funding model. Now, keep in mind, the Tourism Improvement District model is industry-led. So this is industry getting together and being managed by a board of directors saying, we agree to these changes, we vote these changes. Visit California is the conduit to then execute with that budget. So that was quite a change for them about a year ago. Now, as a derivative of that, San Francisco um, devised a mandatory tourism improvement district. I'm not quite sure how they arrived at the mandatory, but what it was is they've created two rings. The inner ring having a higher rate, and that's kind of the downtown CBD hoteliers. As you're a little bit further away from that, you would pay a fee, but it would be a smaller fee. This is mandatory for all their hoteliers to essentially make San Francisco more competitive. They were lagging behind. The funding wasn't keeping up with other big destinations, and so the industry forced this and made it mandatory. So that was one way to go about it. On the flip side, Vancouver went with a voluntary tourism improvement district. There was a feeling in Vancouver that hotels, oddly enough, weren't as involved in the tourism marketing process, and that they should be more involved. So a coalition of voluntary hotels got together and came up with the framework for their own TID. That fund is collected on behalf of, I think it's 27 hotels that volunteer to pay this. When you volunteer, you do have to commit to, I believe it is a 3-year term, after which then you can deem to be out of it or continue on. So what was interesting about this is that you have what's called a Tourism Business Improvement District, but there's completely different ways to collect and administrate it. So what I'm getting here is that the TID, the only difference is the money doesn't flow through the government. It's collected by private business, other hotels or other industry, and give it to a third party to then execute their mandate with. There's no government intervention, with the exception of certain legislation may need to be passed to collect the tourism improvement district fees. Another example of this, and maybe a little bit more controversial, is Niagara Falls. So in Ontario, Canada, they passed a tourism improvement district of legislation allowing any region within Ontario to create this. So Niagara Falls has administered and created this, but what's happened now, because it's a voluntary fee for any business, and it ranges from, I believe, 1 to 10%, each business is allowed to administrate it themselves. But as a consumer, you don't have to pay the fee. It is a voluntary fee. It looks official on your bill. You'll see a DMF or a TID or a tourism levy fee, and it's called a bunch of things. But if you demand it be taken off your bill, you have that right to do so. Now, what's happening in Niagara is many consumers are seeing this, and they're seeing that it's different per hotel or per restaurant, and there's no continuity across how this is administered. So it's gotten a lot of negative news about it. I'm not sure what the future of it looks like for them, but this just kind of goes to show the negative side if it's not administered in a cohesive way. And then lastly, on a kind of a high note, Visit England. They have been doing a lot of research on the California model, and what they've just recently approved a couple of years ago, I think 2-3 years ago, was they passed a tourism improvement legislation allowing up to, I think it was 100 different TIDs to spring up around England. So this has been hugely successful for them. They've learned from the California model and administrated a few checks and balances to make sure it's very well balanced, governed, and that there's no political issues that may occur. So there's actually a few good documents that they've laid out that shows the path, the education needed for industry to understand how a TID can benefit the community. So this has been very successful for them thus far. They're kind of new in it, but I think it'll be kind of version 2 of what a successful a tourism improvement district model looks like. And as I mentioned, many of their communities have latched onto this. So taking a look at the TBID or TID, many forms you want to call it, the key thing is legislation may be required, and it's going to be different for every city, state, and country. So that's something you'll have to check with your local policymakers. Many destinations already have the legislative framework for business improvement districts, and this may be able to spring up underneath that. So that's one way I would pursue in terms of figuring out the legalities. The great thing about the TBID is it's very flexible in how you deploy it. Vancouver and San Francisco have chosen to put it on the backs of hotels. California includes the car rentals, attractions, etc. It so happens the car rental is actually one of the largest revenue generators for the industry there. So there's a lot of different ways that you can deploy this for your stakeholders and community. The industry guides investment because this isn't industry-led. They're collecting the funds voluntarily or mandatory, depending on some circumstances, and they're giving it to you, the DMO, a third party. Therefore, they get a larger say in what the outcomes need to be. What is nice about this model is that it does mitigate the political volatility with government entities. On the downside, you have industry risk that may spring up. So there's kind of a balance here. In some cases, I'm seeing a balance between a bed tax with a TBID as well to kind of align two different spectrums for revenue purposes. So that's kind of the gamut of what the different funding models and kind of the trends are. The two big ones that I really highlight are the cost recovery and the tourism business improvement district. So those seem to be the kind of the trends happening now. So at Forum in October, we took a deeper look at these scenarios. We had thought leaders and CEOs from all around the world from various different tourism bodies, and we wanted to look deeper at how we can actually impact our revenue models, because it's not as easy as simply asking for more money. What we found was that there's three challenges that really will help pave the way for an increase in revenue or new funding models. This is all outlined in our white paper that was released some time ago. It will be available following this presentation as well. But the first one, obviously, we've been talking about is a lack of diversified revenue streams with an unstable political landscape. This is just that volatility, government elections, etc., like that, and finding a balanced way to have revenue sources from industry or the right sources to ensure that we can plan long term and we don't have these political and instability. And then I think this is a constant challenge, but the lack of understanding of the value of tourism. And I don't mean just the marketing, what we're doing, look at our campaigns, look at our results. I'm talking the contribution to jobs. I'm also looking at how tourism affects other industries and other sectors. Some destinations such as Cleveland and Switzerland have done a lot of research and data to really understand this, because it's no longer about look at our campaign numbers and what we did. We need to show how we're providing value to the community at a deep level. Even giving back to public infrastructure. How are we helping improve air infrastructure, maybe transportation infrastructure? So making that picture quite clear. And then the third challenge is a changing industry landscape, which may include various geopolitical, economic, or other changes. So there's quite a bit to that. So we've summarized this in terms of the business impacts. We looked at kind of in Venn diagram situation, how these three challenges play together. At the top, if you have undiversified revenue and the changing industry landscape, including things like Airbnb, Uber, etc., you have a reduced ability to adjust your strategies. On the lower left side, changing industry landscape and a lack of understanding of the value of tourism, you're losing your competitiveness. On the right side, bottom right, the undiverse revenue streams with a lack of understanding of the value of tourism, you have a risk to stable long-term funding. Who's going to fund you if they don't really understand what you're doing? And that is a huge risk to your single revenue stream. So more importantly, looking at the solutions. Two of the solutions that we define to pave a new funding model would be defining the value of tourism within the community. And this is that deep definition of value of tourism, jobs, etc., like that. And then secondly, creating a destination's long-term tourism strategy with a unified vision that includes residents and businesses, and it goes deeper than just the tourism sector itself. The reason this is all important is I was kind of looking at the cost recovery with Barcelona and Aruba, but for DMOs, we need to be thinking about what is the DNA of our destination? Where do we want to be and what do we want to be 5-10 years down the road? To do that, we need to understand our place DNA. This affects the culture of our people, the history, the economy, the climate, all these factors play in. Our roles as DMOs are moving away from promotions to managing the DNA of a destination. If we don't take lead of a vision and direct and facilitate the right stakeholders, you run the risk of becoming an accidental tourism destination with a bunch of hotels, but not a lot of attractions or experiences. So finding this balance is becoming more and more critical as DMOs have changed and evolved in the last few years. Just to kind of leave you with some concepts and tips in terms of the value of tourism, I would urge you to consider expanding from purely marketing indicators. You know, looking at campaign numbers and reach and impressions. Those things are nice, but there's a bigger gap between, you know, jobs and how do we correlate this to the resident happiness and the quality of life for residents. This is something that Aruba has done. They have a resident happiness and a quality of life. Another one to consider is destination desirability. Cleveland and Switzerland have acknowledged that the more attractive their destination is worldwide, the easier it is to attract people for jobs and bigger businesses. Switzerland was quite interesting, and they realized as the Swiss brand grows, a lot of businesses, the watch sector, piggybacks off that name recognition and quality recognition. And then lastly, just rethinking heads and beds. It's in occupancy rates and ADR. I'm sure they're important, but there's other sectors as well. How are we measuring attractions and tours and all these other sectors that have a massive role to play in tourism? And that's really important to measure so that we can shift away from a dependency of hotels. They're very important, but most people don't go to a destination just to stay in a hotel. It's a secondary reason for being there. From the unified vision, just some things to think about there, but a true unified tourism strategy should have a sustainable vision that includes residents. Residents need to have a say in that. Barcelona is a prime example. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, but there is a lot of unhappiness amongst residents. And this is happening in other communities with a high tourism cap as well. You know, as I kind of mentioned, we're shifting a little bit away from just a promotional side of things to factor in how do we manage these complexities of, you know, sustainability, eco issues, et cetera, like that. So we kind of need to play a role in destination management, which might be in coordination with government stakeholders, et cetera, but somebody leads to lead the industry and connect all these dots for everyone. Lastly, with the unified vision is focusing on the experience. How are you building and growing your destination? Are you going to become the Vegas? Is that what you want to aspire to? Everything shiny and new? That may be a route for your destination, but you need to look at your DNA and determine, is that the path you want to go? Because thinking about these things now will help set a sustainable growth plan for your community, for your residents, and for your tourism sector as well. And sometimes infinite growth isn't always the best solution here. And then lastly, we've been talking about a diverse funding model, but being really strategic about where are we collecting revenue, and is it good revenue? Are we nickel and diming our stakeholders for small projects like web ads or visitor guide, or are we setting a long-term sustainable plan that they can kind of get behind and buy into the vision and not feel like they're just being double dipped and charged for all these little minutia projects. So just to kind of wrap up as we move to questions, some of my parting thoughts in terms of thinking about if I was to start a new DMO, what would I really be thinking about? I think the first thing I've kind of alluded to quite a bit is having a balanced approach and not being dependent on hotels. Nothing wrong with hotels, but it needs to come from other industries and sectors as well within the tourism environment. Incorporating a destination development plan. Where are you going to grow? Are you going to build more hotels? Because when you get occupancy rate of 70% and you add a new hotel, now that rate goes to 60%, and it's like playing whack-a-mole. You have more rooms and more heads to fill, and et cetera like that, and it becomes unsustainable. So having a plan to grow new attractions, new experiences, thinking about how you disperse people to the right areas of your community, your province, your county, etc., is really important. Otherwise, like Venice, they'll all be, Barcelona, everybody comes in downtown off a cruise ship. Thinking about the effort versus revenue costs. Some things take a lot of time and money, collecting membership dues, those visitor guides, etc. Is the man hours worth the net output of it? Don't forget about the consumer. We have to realize this is a consumer-driven industry. We need to appeal to customers. Mass tourism is kind of going away in favor of niche tourism. So how do we build our destination to appeal to the right audiences that are going to give back to our community and be sustainable long-term? And then lastly, the irony of talking about funding models and new DMO models, but more revenue may not be the solution. I've worked with DMOs. I've been in the DMO where every year we want more budget, but nobody stops to think, what are we going to stop doing to do more with next year with the same amount? Instead, we tend to get more money and do more work, and we're all working crazy hours. Maybe that's not the right solution. Maybe there's a better balance of being more efficient with where you spend your money. So with that, we'll wrap up, and we have some time for questions.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much, Aaron, for that great presentation and for walking us through the different funding models and how destinations are trying to adapt. And as Aaron mentioned, well, he did a lot of research in preparation for this, but also we were able to gather the insights of many destination marketing leaders in our Destination Think Forum event in New York in October. And so that the white paper that he mentioned was the result of that event, and that is available for download. And we'll let you know how afterwards. And so, yeah, we do have time for a few questions. I had one that came in from Nicholas, who says, what is the relation between the different funding models and the actual economic value they may add to the destination? And how do you measure this?
Great question. So in terms of looking at the different models, to be honest, there isn't a linear differentiation between a tax model or a TBID and the business output. The real difference is in the data sharing and data capturing. When you work through a government system, those results of revenues and things like that are kept private and not shared collectively. Through a TBID, if the industry is willing and they agree to it, they may be more forthcoming with some of their data and their research. So I think funding models not necessarily directly tied to actual economic outputs, unless you have a strong government that says we want to go after this sector or this market for other political reasons. That does happen from time to time, but on the flip side, you may have an industry that says we only want to cater to these big countries or big cities. So I think there's no difference. It just depends how you manage those stakeholder requests and their needs. Ideally, I would say that you'd want a blended model if you could, a little bit of taxation with the TBID model, so that you have a balanced approach and you manage diverse stakeholder needs. Great question.
Perfect. Thanks, Aaron. And if you have any more questions, feel free to type them in right now as we go through them. I have another one from Robin, who says, do you have any suggestions of what models would work the best for rural small community tourism organizations?
Yes, I think more so in a smaller community where tourism is much more visible. Should you deploy a balanced model that includes attractions, maybe even art galleries, etc., like that. Some ways I've seen this rolled out is under a TBID model. Hoteliers will pay, say, a 3% on their revenues, and then smaller businesses would pay a 1%. So they're still contributing, but it's not as much because of the balance of overall visitation. Some of those other sectors that are non-hoteliers are still giving back to residents. So they don't want to be taxed on what residents may pay, et cetera, like that. So I think for smaller communities, you want a very balanced portfolio. That way everybody is giving back to the community. And then lastly, and more importantly, what is the data you capture? How can you, with a smaller community, really measure the impact of tourism? And I think that's the beautiful thing about a smaller community, is it would be easier to have those conversations and identify that connection of visitor to the overall economy. In a bigger city like Vancouver or New York, it's much more difficult to see where all the visitation revenue goes. So I think smaller communities are in a great place with a very balanced model. And I would urge you to consider, if you can, the Tourism Business Improvement District. And then if there are, lastly, any environmental areas, that might be something you work with your local city or provincial legislators to say, hey, look, we notice a significant environmental impact here, and maybe propose and take a leadership role to them to help protect your assets.
Perfect. Thanks, Aaron. We had another question about how the models might impact, or sorry, how changing consumer behavior might impact funding models. Is there a relationship there?
Ooh, good. That's a good one. I think this will be a roundabout one, but I think the first thing is that consumers are becoming a little bit more savvy in terms of their price points. As I mentioned, some destinations have a clear 13% tax. If you've stayed all-inclusive, you'd probably pay a resort tax of 15%. But when you look at your bill, 15%, 13%, 2%, 6%, it starts to stack up. At a certain point, the tourism industry is its own worst friend in creating these taxes upon taxes, and consumers will just kind of tune out of some destinations because they're paying so much of the burden. In terms of consumer behaviors affecting the models, yes, I think one of the big ones and obvious examples is Airbnb. That probably caught many cities and jurisdictions, off guard because they were thinking hotels only, and they had no clue how to enforce this with Airbnb. And what quickly happened is many destinations just ruled it out because of hotel associations and their lobbying efforts saying no. But from a consumer perspective, we're noticing a trend to live like a local or travel like a local. And so that Airbnb experience can be a very emotional travel experience. Uber's kind of similar in the transportation world. But at the flip side, there's other issues that should be discussed with Airbnb, such as in Vancouver, where I live, occupancy rates are really low. So do consumers want Airbnb, or residents want Airbnb when it's going to take away from the rental pool, which is already ridiculously small? So this is kind of where I'm kind of going with the value of tourism needs to be clearly laid out to a diverse set of stakeholders, because more and more we're seeing the overlap between different sectors. And we, rather than being reactive, we need to take a leadership role and lead everybody else through this kind of this maze, because the sharing economy is just the tip of it. There's going to be more innovation coming down the wave, and we just need to be prepared to adapt. But we need to do it with our stakeholders in a balanced approach and not pander to any one sector, because it may hurt us down the road.
Yeah, and so, as you mentioned before during the presentation, you're talking about demonstrating value to stakeholders and how that's such a critical piece of this, no matter which funding model you're using. So how do you approach demonstrating that value to stakeholders as a destination?
Oh, geez, really good questions, guys. I think demonstrating value to your stakeholders goes many ways. And the first is getting away from purely promotions. We've, as an industry, taught our stakeholders to, hey, look at our shiny creative. We did a TV spot, or we did some print pieces, and that's what industry became accustomed to seeing. That looks good. They have trust in that you're spending that money correctly. But with the change in the marketing landscapes, being visible with our marketing efforts, like content marketing and digital ads, your stakeholders probably should never see it if you're doing it right. So to reinforce that trust that we're doing things right, we need to be more transparent in the process. One which way is having more collaborative town hall meetings with your residents and businesses to get input on direction. Obviously, that has to be managed in a very thoughtful, methodical approach. Otherwise, it could turn into literally a town hall meeting with pitchforks. But being transparent like that is kind of the new way of doing business, and finding smaller ways to engage your industry in the development of marketing solutions. One example would be taking a small sector, or maybe it's the fishing sector, and working with them to understand, what does the fishing sector need? Who are their best customers? And going through that customer journey to then target fishers and do a better job of reaching those audiences on behalf of our industry. Maybe the conversation goes like this: dear fishing industry, we're going to do some campaigns to bring more fisher people out here, but we want you to share some of your revenues with us so we can see, did we make a dent? Are we doing a good job of marketing and growing that sector? And if so, who are your customers? Who are your best customers that we should target more of? And who are the customers that we shouldn't waste our money targeting? So having those conversations with industry is very transparent, and now the value goes both ways. So I think piloting thinking like that would be one of the creative ways that we can really show more value to industry and stakeholders. Did I answer that, David? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. That'll be our last question for today. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone out there. We'll email you a link of the recording of this webinar soon, so stay tuned for that. Aaron's clearly got a depth of knowledge on this subject and many other strategic topics for DMOs, so feel free to reach out to him with any further questions you have to the email address there, aaron@destinationthink.com. And again, we share plenty of insights at our website. You can find out more about the next webinar at destinationthink.com/webinars. And the white paper URL is listed there as well, /whitepaper. We are hosting another forum conference in New York City in October 2017. Visit our forum page to find out how you can be a part of that and take part in these collaborations where destinations are working on these difficult topics together. As Destination Think, we've got lots of tools to help destinations with these challenges, identifying place DNA, consulting on long-term strategies. So if you have a question about how we can help you with that, reach out to Aaron as well. We also review RFP submissions every week, so feel free to send those our way. Or email us if you have an idea for a future webinar topic, because we'd love to find out how we can help your destination marketing team. And so with that, I'll let you go. Thank you so much for your participation today. Have a great day or night, as it is, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks, everybody.